He was trapped between two wooden boats. Naked. Helpless. Drenched in milk and honey, left under the blazing sun. Not for hours, but for days. Weeks. His flesh rotted as insects feasted. His mind shattered long before his body did. This wasn't execution. It was a slow, calculated erasure of humanity. And it has a name most historians fear to even whisper. Scaphism. He was bound. Stripped. Laid down into a narrow wooden shell, a hollowed-out log barely wide enough to hold a man. Another log, carved just like it, was lowered over him, sandwiching his body but leaving his head, hands and feet exposed. His arms thrashed, legs kicked, neck twisted. But there was no escape. This was not a prison. It was a coffin designed to keep him alive. Honey was smeared across his face. Then milk, thick, sour, was poured into his mouth until it spilled out over his beard. His skin was coated with sweetness. His eyes darted toward the sun. He knew what came next. This was not execution. It was something far worse. This was scaphism. A method of death so slow, so sickening, that the mind breaks before the body does. You don't die in hours, or days. You die over weeks, stripped of your dignity, your sanity, your very identity, as the natural world devours you. But before we watch this man die, we must understand where this nightmare began, and why someone somewhere believed he deserved it. The Empire of Persia, power and paranoia. Scaphism was not the invention of madmen in the shadows. It was a state-sanctioned punishment in one of the most sophisticated empires in ancient history, the Achaemenid Persian Empire. This was the realm of Darius the Great and Xerxes I, kings who commanded vast armies and ruled over millions. It was an empire of gold, science and law, but also of suspicion, betrayal and brutal control. The victim at the center of this horror? A man named Mithridates. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a king. He was, by some accounts, a simple courtier, possibly a nobleman. But one mistake sealed his fate. He insulted the king. Not with a weapon. Not with a rebellion. With words. The crime that cost him everything. The king, likely Artaxerxes II, had just won a rare military victory. As celebrations echoed through the palace, the royal herald proclaimed that it was the king himself who had personally killed the enemy general. But Mithridates, watching from the shadows, scoffed. The truth? The general had been killed by Mithridates himself, not the king. And he made the fatal error of correcting the record. It was a moment of pride, of honesty, maybe even arrogance. But in the Empire of Persia, truth could be treason. The king, furious that his glory was questioned, ordered the worst punishment imaginable. He did not want Mithridates dead. He wanted Mithridates erased. The ritual begins. Scaphism wasn't just about killing. It was a ritual of humiliation and decay. The condemned was laid between two boats or hollowed-out logs, nailed shut except for the openings around the head, feet, and hands. Then came the feasting. Milk and honey were poured into the victim's mouth until vomiting began, a deliberate act, meant to fill the stomach with curdled rot. More honey was smeared on the skin, in the eyes, ears, even genitals, inviting insects from every direction. Under the hot Persian sun, the wood turned into an oven. Flies gathered. Ants marched. Worms bred in open wounds. Feces and vomit pooled around the victim's body inside the wooden shell, turning it into a living swamp of infection. And all the while he remained alive. Why so cruel? This was not just torture. It was a message. In a world ruled by kings who claimed divine favor, disobedience, even in speech, was seen as cosmic treason. To challenge the king was to challenge the order of the universe. And that demanded a punishment that went beyond death. Scaphism transformed a human being into a slow-motion corpse. Every day guards would check to see if the victim still breathed. If he did, more milk, more honey, more insects. The cycle repeated. Again. And again. It wasn't enough to destroy the body. The punishment had to break the soul, to erase not just a man but his memory. But something else made it worse. The condemned was conscious. Flies nested in his mouth and nostrils. Maggots fed on the flesh between his fingers. His eyes swelled. His mind, once sharp enough to speak truth to power, began to crumble. He may have prayed for death. Day one. He was still lucid. Still aware. Still trying to resist. The log coffin baked in the sun like a clay oven. Inside, Mithridates' body floated in his own vomit and feces. The milk and honey had done their job. He was bloated, feverish but breathing. Flies covered his face in a living veil. He shook his head. Blinked. Twitched. But there was no escape. Each tiny sting from an insect was a warning shot of what was to come. This was only the beginning. Outside the wooden shell, life went on. Guards lounged in the shade. They laughed, played dice, and occasionally threw more honey across his face. They weren't monsters. They were following orders. Some might have even pitted him, but none disobeyed. Not in Persia. By day 2, the insects were no longer just feeding, they were nesting. The invasion of the body. Beetles chewed through soft skin at the corners of his eyes. Ants tunneled beneath his fingernails. Maggots writhed beneath his ears, between his toes. His once noble hands, the same hands that had held weapons, books, or wine, were now swollen sacks of rotting flesh. But the most horrific assault was internal. The milk and honey, once sweet, had fermented in his gut. His intestines swelled. Diarrhea poured from him constantly. And the insects followed that scent too. Parasites crawled into his anus, his genitals, his open mouth. The shell around him became a warm, decaying biome, alive with organisms feeding on him, laying eggs in him, thriving off his slow, conscious death. And he could feel it all. The mind begins to shatter. By day 4, his voice was gone. His throat, burned from vomiting and screaming, had reduced to dry croaks and gasps. His lips blistered. His tongue swelled. His face looked like something inhuman, bloated, blackened, eyes swollen shut from insect bites. But he still breathed. He heard the guards speak. He heard them laugh. He heard his name. But he couldn't respond. His body had become a prison of silence, and yet the pain never left him. He could still think. He could still feel. He could still remember what he did, and wonder if one proud sentence had really deserved this hell. The world watches and learns. Scaphism was not a hidden punishment. It was designed to be seen. Some victims were left to die near water, where snakes and river insects would join the feast. Others were displayed near roads, where passers-by, enemies, subjects, children, could see firsthand what happened when the king's image was challenged. Mithridates too was not alone. Word of his punishment spread. Stories reached courts across the empire. His name became a whisper, not of admiration but of warning. The king's lie had been protected. The truth-teller had been silenced, slowly, publicly, and with a cruelty so extravagant that no one dared repeat his mistake. But death was not mercy Persia offered lightly. That was the point. This wasn't justice. It was political theater, a masterpiece of psychological warfare, crafted not with swords, but with insects, rot, and time. Day 7, flesh peels, bones show. It had now been a full week. By this point, most men would have died from infection, shock, or organ failure. But Mithridates, perhaps cursed with a strong constitution, still clung to life. His skin had begun to slough off in places, melting like candle wax in the heat. His hands and feet, once exposed to open air, now looked like meat left to rot in a swamp. His fingernails had peeled. His fingertips gnawed by insects to the bone. Some say he began to hallucinate, speaking to people who weren't there. Others say he went silent, eyes frozen open, trapped inside a mind that could no longer tell dream from reality. He wasn't alive. But he wasn't dead either. He was something else, a man-shaped ecosystem of death, half man, half carrion. Why no one spoke up? Surely someone could have stopped it. Surely one soldier could have opened the log, given him water, ended the pain. But in an empire ruled by fear and hierarchy, compassion was treason too. To interfere with royal justice was to question the king, the same crime Mithridates had committed. Everyone knew their place. And Mithridates' place was in that box, baking alive in milk, honey, feces, and rot. So they watched. And they waited. Just like we do now, as we follow him into the second week of torment. Day 10. By now, the man inside the box was barely recognizable. The swelling had made his limbs grotesque. The skin had turned black and green, mottled with necrosis. Boils erupted along his arms. His mouth hung open permanently, jaw locked in a slack grimace. The stench alone was enough to make grown men retch. It wasn't just death, it was death in progress. Yet still he breathed. The punishment was working exactly as intended. He was being eaten alive, not just from the outside but from within. The horror of conscious decay. Inside his gut, bacteria flourished. The same milk and honey mixture that attracted flies on the outside also fermented inside him. It had long since destroyed his digestion. His intestines were infected. Gas built up in his belly, pushing his organs apart, bloating his torso until it looked like it might burst. Every breath was a struggle. Not because he lacked air, but because his own organs were failing. His lungs wheezed with fluid. His liver likely ruptured. But it was slow. so terribly, unnaturally slow. And his nervous system, that cruel miracle of biology, still worked. He still felt everything. Every twitch of a maggot under his eyelid. Every nibble of a beetle along his groin. Every sting from wasps that had started nesting inside the shell. They called it divine justice. To the ancient Persians, this wasn't just punishment. It was symbolic. It was cosmic. The body of a man who spoke against the divine king was now being returned to nature, broken down by its smallest creatures. Flies, worms, mold, rats. Even birds sometimes landed nearby, pecking at fingers that stuck out from the wooden seams. He was being unmade, stripped of ego, identity, even physical integrity. It wasn't enough for him to die. He had to be erased. Day 12, he tries to speak. There are reports, disturbing, almost unbelievable, that around day 12 Mithridates made a sound. Not a scream. Not a word. A murmur. A wet rasp. As if trying to pray or beg or whisper the name of the king who did this to him. But his tongue had swollen so badly it filled his mouth like a sponge. His throat was rotted. The sound came out like a death rattle dragged across a rusted pipe. Still, it meant something terrifying. He was still there. Some sliver of the man who once served the king, who once dared speak truth, still flickered inside that rotting husk. And that flicker was still suffering. The world keeps watching. Even now the guards didn't look away. The logs were occasionally turned, not to help him but to spread the rot more evenly. They added more honey. They poured milk into his mouth to keep him from dying of thirst too quickly. Sometimes children from nearby villages were brought to see him, as a warning. This is what happens when you speak treason, the elders would whisper. He had become a living fable, a grotesque monument to obedience. And in the twisted logic of empire, the longer he survived, the stronger the story became. Day 14, death beckons. 2 weeks. 14 days of agony. By now, most of the soft tissue was gone. His eyes were collapsed. His skin was peeling in sheets. Bones peeked out from his feet and elbows. The coffin was slick with pus and blood. Still the insects came. Still the guards watched. Still he did not die. He had become less a man and more a symbol. Not just of punishment but of power, the kind of power that could invent a death so cruel, so precise, so nightmarishly effective, that no one would even think of repeating his mistake. The king had made an example of Mithridates. And Mithridates had become a legend of horror. Day 15. The air was still. No birds chirped. Even the guards posted nearby kept their distance now, not out of mercy but revulsion. The man once called Mithridates was no longer human in appearance. His face had collapsed in on itself. His nose had decayed entirely, leaving just a hole. His ears were rotted nubs. His jaw hung loose, swaying with every weak gasp of air. And yet, he was still alive. Barely. But undeniably. His chest rose and fell with shallow, rattling breaths. His heart thumped, slow, arrhythmic but present. The will to survive had long since abandoned him. What was left was pure biological cruelty, the body's refusal to die, even after the soul had given up. A body beyond death. The internal rot was total. The milk and honey had fermented inside his intestines, feeding not only bacteria but an endless bloom of yeast and fungal infection. His stomach was likely liquefied. His kidneys had shut down days ago. His bloodstream was septic, toxic from head to toe. The skin sloughed off his arms when touched. Fungal colonies, white, fuzzy patches, had spread across his chest. Wounds no longer bled because there was no blood pressure left to force it out. And still, somehow, he lingered. No screams. No begging. Just wet, ragged moans. And sometimes not even that. Just silence, save for the buzz of flies and the soft crunch of larvae feeding beneath his rib cage. Death denied and delayed. By now, the execution had surpassed cruelty. It had become ritualistic, a spectacle of dominance. The Persian king, Artaxerxes II, had made a declaration: let treason be remembered not just in story but in sight, sound, and smell. And so the guards were ordered to continue. They poured more honey across the exposed muscle. They poured milk into the crater where his mouth had been. They turned the logs again, letting sunlight reach every diseased inch of his body. They did this not to prolong life, but to prolong death. Because the longer he lived, the longer his suffering could echo across the empire. The moment of release, day 17. On the 17th day something shifted. His breathing, once shallow, suddenly stopped. Not dramatically. There was no gasp, no violent thrashing, no death rattle. Just stillness. A guard approached. He looked closely. Waited. No movement. Another leaned in with a sharpened stick and prodded the remains. No sound. No twitch. No reflex. He was gone. What had once been Mithridates, court official, soldier, traitor, was now just a rotting shell. A collapsed monument of horror. And yet, in death he was still powerful. They called it scaphism. The Persians had a name for this horror, scaphism. A method of execution so cruel, so unique, that it was reserved for only the greatest traitors. Victims were trapped between two boats or hollowed-out logs, force-fed milk and honey, and left in stagnant water, exposed to insects, rot, and time. It was not meant to kill quickly. It was designed to erase, not just the body, but the idea of rebellion. And Mithridates' suffering had been perfect. A death that outlived the body. The story spread like wildfire. From Persian lands into Greek chronicles, through Roman historians, and eventually across continents. Even centuries later, writers like Plutarch and Lucian of Samosata described it with awe and revulsion. Poets whispered it. Emperors studied it. Mithridates had become something more than a victim. He was a warning made flesh. A grotesque myth that spoke louder than 1,000 executions. And unlike quick deaths, like beheading, hanging, or impalement, scaphism echoed. It haunted imaginations. It forced people to ask, what kind of power invents a death like that? The psychology of terror. This wasn't just punishment. It was psychological warfare. To the king, Mithridates' death was a message. Not just to enemies but to friends. To courtiers, generals, advisors. Even if you serve me now, if you betray me tomorrow, this will be you. No one could ignore the lesson. It wasn't just the pain that terrified. It was the duration. The slow strip mining of humanity. The fact that a man could linger halfway between life and death for 17 days, with nothing but insects and decay for company. What blade could compete with that? A death that still haunts. Today, thousands of years later, scaphism remains one of the most horrifying executions ever devised. It defies comprehension. It offends nature. It exposes how creative human cruelty can be when fueled by power and vengeance. But perhaps that's why it's remembered. Because somewhere, in that bloated coffin of horror, was a man. A man who once had a name. A man who dared to speak and died eaten alive from the inside out, so slowly, so thoroughly that his story would never be forgotten. History is filled with horrors, plagues, wars, massacres. But every so often, one single death rises above the chaos. Not for its scale, but for its intimacy. Mithridates' death wasn't a number on a battlefield. It wasn't fast. It wasn't clean. It was personal. A slow-motion descent into biological hell, engineered deliberately not for justice, but for fear. And that's what makes it unforgettable. The power of prolonged suffering. Scaphism wasn't about killing. It was about controlling memory. The executioners weren't trying to end a life. They were trying to carve a message into the minds of everyone who heard about it. That message? If you cross the throne, your death will be so horrific, it will outlive even your body. And they succeeded. Because even today, 2,000 years later, we're still telling Mithridates' story. We remember how he died, not what he did. The betrayal? The insult to the king? Lost in time. But the punishment became legend. The dark genius of scaphism. Let's step back for a moment. Scaphism wasn't just torture, it was designed. Every step had purpose. The honey and milk weren't just humiliation, they created infection and attracted predators. The boats weren't just cages, they made sure no inch of the victim escaped rot. The location wasn't random. Stagnant water meant mosquitoes, heat, decay. The force feeding kept the body alive just long enough for the death to drag on. It was, in a twisted way, scientific. A methodical use of biology, psychology, and environment to create a living nightmare. Echoes of fear through time. Why do we remember deaths like this? Because they tap into something primal. Something buried deep in our ancestral memory. Fear of insects. Fear of rot. Fear of being helpless, eaten, violated, exposed. Mithridates' story is unforgettable not because of its politics, but because it makes you feel something. Revulsion. Pity. Dread. It forces you to imagine yourself in that place. Alone. Rotting. And still alive. From execution to immortality. And here lies the paradox. The Persian king wanted to destroy Mithridates, body, legacy, and soul. But in doing so he did the opposite. He immortalized him. Most of the people who lived in that era, kings, generals, priests, are forgotten. But Mithridates? The man who spent 17 days dissolving into a living grave? He lives on. Not because he was powerful. Not because he was noble. but because his suffering was so complete, so total, it could not be erased. The psychology of cruelty. It begs the question, what kind of society creates something like scaphism? The answer is uncomfortable. One with power too centralized, where rulers could act without consequence. One where spectacle mattered more than humanity. And one where fear was the main currency of control. Because cruelty, especially public cruelty, isn't just about the victim. It's about the audience, the guards, the courtiers, the peasants. It says to everyone, this is what happens if you stop obeying. And it works, at least for a while. The fragility of flesh and memory. In the end, Mithridates died. Like all of us will. His flesh fell away. His name eroded. His story warped with retellings. But the image of a man eaten alive over 17 days, that remains. A permanent stain in the record of human cruelty. And that's the terrifying power of stories like this. They remind us not just of what was done, but of what we're still capable of. Final words. Scaphism wasn't the only horrific execution in history, but it might be the most deliberate. It weaponized time, biology, and human imagination. It was punishment turned into performance. A death dragged out until the body gave up, and the world remembered. And maybe that's the most chilling part. Not that one man died like this, but that someone else designed it, and somewhere someone watched.